It's a great pleasure to talk to Rowan Williams. When and where were you born?
In Swansea in 1950.
And that's very precise, so we know that bit. Going back as far as you like on either side, people like sometimes to talk about their grandparents or even further back, establish the kind of family they come from. Can you fill us in on that?
Yes, I can a bit. My mother's family, on her mother's side, had been in the Swansea Valley in the same village for about a century and a half. That's Ystad Gunlais, which was the family home, and although I was born in Swansea, that was in a nursing home. The family lived in Ystad Gunlais. Before that bit of the family had come from over the border in Carmarthenshire, the Llanfaesant area, just on the other side of the Black Mountains and Llyn. My mother's father was a Pembrokeshire man, somewhere around Haverfordwest, and he'd migrated to the Swansea Valley and arrived speaking only English and had to learn Welsh when he arrived because he came from the English-speaking part of Pembrokeshire. My father's family, mostly from, again, the upper Swansea Valley, and some from Dowlais and the upper Rhondda. On the whole, my mother's family were farmers and farm labourers. My father's were miners. So when my father married my mother, the two families didn't entirely get on.
What was the difference in their characteristics of mining and farming, apart from being above the ground and below the ground?
There was a certain social distance, I think. Farming was a little bit more respectable, I suppose, in people's eyes. And farming and shopkeeping, I suppose my mother's immediate family were probably more in shopkeeping than farming. The cousins were on the farms. And opposite ends of the village, and my father's eldest brother worked for my mother's uncle on a farm as a casual labourer for a while, and that hadn't been a very happy experience. So I think it was all a bit complicated for a while.
Did they, were they from educated backgrounds at all?
No. My mother's eldest sister had gone to college and trained as a teacher, but apart from that, nobody had anything resembling higher education.
Did you know them as people, as characters? I mean, did any grandparent have an influence on you? Or?
The only grandparent who survived into my childhood really was my mother's mother. My father lost both his parents when he was very young and was basically brought up by his eldest sister, which was not uncommon in those days. And yes, very, very strongly marked characters, all right. My father's 3 unmarried sisters and 1 unmarried brother lived together, and it was a very, remember, it was a very noisy household. This very powerful personality, my father's oldest sister dominating. She was, she'd had a rather bad accident at one point, couldn't walk very well, and tended to sit around with a leg up, barking orders at the family. She was very formidable. My mother's mother was just, I think, a very typical valley chapel, middle class.
They were all chapel, were they?
They were all chapel, I think, yes. Not very devoutly so, but if you'd asked them, that's what they would have been.
Moving to your parents, what sort of characters and how did they influence your life?
My mother was one of 5, but she was brought up more or less as an only child. She was brought up by an aunt. I've never quite understood this, but when she was very small, she went to live with her mother's sister and was brought up more or less as the only child of that sister, and went to a convent school, which is extremely unusual. And it may be that my grandmother felt she would have more opportunities if she lived with Auntie Polly.
So it was a kind of fostering.
And again, I don't think that was uncommon. People talk about the timeless fixed patterns of families in village life. Actually, my recollection is of chaotically complicated relationships sometimes.
Yes.
So my mother had a bit more education than most of the rest of the family, apart from her eldest sister. And when she was young, I think, had some aspirations to be a bit more of a professional. She was a very good pianist.
So music was there in your life?
Music was there, and I can remember her when I was young as a really very forceful, energetic performer on the piano.
Classical? Or?
Classical. My father, I think what saved him from the mines was the war. He went to serve in the war in the RAF, trained effectively as an engineer in the RAF, and so when he emerged at the end of the war, he had some opportunities that others hadn't had.
Did he serve in England in the RAF? Or
he was in France for a bit, but talked hardly ever about it. So he eventually went into what was then the Ministry of Works and designed heating and lighting systems for public buildings.
What were their characters? I mean, were they...
My mother, very emotional, very extrovert, loved to be at the centre of social things, loved entertaining. My father, very, very subdued, very quiet and private.
It's very contrasting.
Very contrasting, yes.
Where did you first go to school?
In Cardiff. We'd moved away from the Swansea Valley when I was about 4. My father's work, basically, I think. And because I'd had a rather complicated health record as a small child, I went to a little private school in Cardiff. I think they thought my nerves were...
Meningitis?
Meningitis when I was 2, yes. And that took a while to clear up one way and another. And I was also very prone to bronchitis and things like that. So I think they felt my nerves wouldn't stand up to ordinary primary school.
In those sort of formative years, 4, 5, 6, what was your first memory?
My very first memory, I think, would be the National Eisteddfod in about 1954. I must have been about 4. Now, when the National Eisteddfod comes to town, it's a great event for a Welsh village or town. And I can just about remember that week when clearly something was going on that was very important, and there were people having singing competitions and people talking about that. And I remember that, and I remember a circus procession in the village street somewhere around that time also. That's, I think, the very earliest memories. And also, yes, probably again when I was about 4, one Christmas when it snowed. And footprints in the snow in the back garden on Christmas morning.
Sounds like a poem.
Yes.
Did you have any particular hobbies or interests as a child?
I think because I was a rather sickly child. I was never any use at all at sport, and I'm afraid I didn't try very hard. So as far as hobbies are concerned, it was really just reading. I was an obsessive reader.
Really?
Absolutely obsessive. And because I spent quite a bit of time in bed, being ill one way or another, that was an obvious way of passing the time.
You're wearing glasses now. Are they for short-sightedness? Or?
Yes.
When did you go short-sighted?
I don't think I wore glasses before I was about 11 or 12, actually.
So I've written a book or chapter on myopia and the myopic personality, and that is the person who reads a lot and then it's reinforced by the fact they're not interested in games. So what was your first sort of proper school? What age did you go to? I mean, you went to a kindergarten and then to a primary school?
Well, as I say, it's a little private school, private primary school, which operated out of a suburban house in Cardiff. It must have been only a few dozen children, I think.
Was it all right?
It was all right, I think, yes. Yes. I remember it as very much dominated by the personality of a head teacher of a very old-fashioned kind, a headmistress, a spinster lady of a certain age and background. But I think we were encouraged to read, we were encouraged to learn poetry. Yes.
And then Did you take 11 plus or?
Yes, I took the 11 plus, but at that time we were moving house again. My father's job had taken him back to Swansea. So we moved back there, and I went to secondary school in Swansea, which was a bit of a rude shock because a very large state school in a town I didn't know with people I didn't know. The first few pretty grueling.
Yes. Were you bullied?
Yes.
It was girls and boys, presumably.
No, just boys.
Just boys. So there were all the rituals of induction.
Yes. And I think I must have been a very bullyable boy. But that being said, by the time I left that school, I was deeply in love with it.
Really?
And I'm still in touch with my school friends from those days. And I think we all agree that we had an extraordinary education of the old-style Welsh grammar school variety.
Well, my teacher, Keith Thomas, went to Barry Grammar School,
Indeed.
as did many famous academics, and they seem to have been extremely good school.
I think so. I think there was quite a strong sense in most of these schools that if a child showed signs of real interest in something, well, you ran with it. You'd lend them books, you'd give them time, and that's a large part of my memory of it. Teachers taking time beyond ours to talk, to encourage, teachers lending books, saying, oh, you ought to go and see that if there was a play or an opera on, and what seemed really endless availability.
Were you beginning to specialise in an interest in a particular subject by then?
Difficult to answer. I think I was already, by the time I went to secondary school, interested in church, in the Bible, and all that went with that, thinking that maybe when I grew up I might be a minister or something.
How did that happen?
I don't know.
Because your parents weren't?
They weren't particularly committed. No, we went to chapel, went to Sunday school, but it wasn't pushed at me at all. But I think at some point something just caught in the fabric.
At what age do you think that was? Before you went to the grammar?
Before, yes, I'd say 8 or 9 probably.
Oh, interesting.
But I found already in grammar school that my interests in history, in drama, in literature were pretty well formed, and the school looked after them very well. What
were you reading at around, say, between 9 and 12? What books?
9 and 12. Let me see.
C.S. Lewis?
Oddly enough, I didn't read much C.S. Lewis till I was a bit older, but I did read quite a bit of fantasy. I was fascinated by mythologies of different kinds.
Tolkien hadn't come out.
Tolkien hadn't really broken the surface then. I liked historical novels. I liked the classic English children's fantasies, E.M. Nesbit especially. I read those books obsessively. I enjoyed Puck of Pook's Hill as well. I liked and still like Kipling.
Good.
And then...
And the Jungle Stories.
Yes, I remember the Jungle books very vividly. But Puck of Pook's Hill, which I think I must have read when I was about 10 for the first time, made a big impact.
It was Sir John Eliot Gardiner's favourite book too.
Is that right?
And mine.
Wonderful. And then...
Were you reading poetry by then?
Not a great deal. I enjoyed it, but wouldn't have said it was a major interest. But it became more so, I think, from 12, 13 onwards.
I mean, those books like Puck and so on describe an integrated, united world where nature and the spirit world are interconnected. The tragedy of my life was that they seemed to split, kind of Cartesian split, when I was about 17 or 18. Was that at all a theme of your life or not?
I think I missed out on the split, really. I felt that particular aspect of Puck and of other fantasies, that there's something just round the corner, as it were, of
Yes.
the routine world, continued to be deeply formative, and I guess had something to do with my faith as well.
Well, that's interesting. I found the conflict. What else were you doing at school? Do you do any drama or politics or any
Yes.
other subjects?
Singing, very regularly, drama increasingly, and the debating society. Yes, I remember the first bits of political education as it were coming through the school debating society, and then in the sixth form, a lot of encouragement to develop that, because we had, I remember, a joint society with the girls' grammar school up the road, which was vastly popular, as you can imagine, and we had a very gifted, very warm and imaginative drama teacher who built up extracurricular things in a big way, who created this inter-school society, which was quite unusual, really. So we had not only a school debating society, but a inter-school debating society and a discussion group that brought in people from both. We produced plays and performed concerts together as schools.
With the girls.
With girls. And looking back, I think we were hugely fortunate in that background assumption that everything was capable of being talked about, that arguments didn't kill you, that the world of the imagination was to be taken as seriously as anything else. And a lot of that is down to this particular teacher and one or two of his colleagues.
Do you remember his name?
Graham Davis, still alive.
Were there any other teachers who inspired you at that time?
Yes. The teacher who started me off with Latin when I was about 13 was one of those who, again, was prepared to give huge amounts of time to lend books and to discuss things and push things a bit further. And he was, I think, one of the first teachers in Wales to introduce Russian to the curriculum.
Gosh, that had an influence in your life.
Well, yes, I didn't study it with him because our options were a bit limited, and I was already in the Latin stream by that point. But he knew I was interested in it, and we would talk about that as about other things. He lived not far from me, so we used to chat on the bus sometimes. And also a very, very good English teacher in the sixth form, who, again, just pushed, nourished, encouraged. If you can spare half an hour on Friday afternoon after we finish, we might have a chat about Thomas Hardy, that sort of thing. And have you thought of reading this, or I think you might find this interesting?
Do you remember who at that age, I say 14, 15 to 18, you were most excited by writers?
Writers. Well,
you must have studied Shakespeare, obviously.
Shakespeare goes without saying.
Milton.
But Milton didn't quite capture me, though we studied him in the sixth form. We had a very interesting selection of poets to do for O-levels, it then was. And that's when I really discovered Thomas Hardy as a poet. I've never been a great lover of him as a novelist, but as a poet I take him very seriously indeed. And we did Hardy and Frost and Edward Thomas, and I think Yeats, all of whom really dug themselves into my mind. And that was perhaps when poetry began to matter seriously.
Hopkins, did you do?
I didn't read much Hopkins at that stage. What I do remember is one particular essay that was set for us when I was, I suppose, in the fifth form, working towards O-levels, from this particular English teacher, who I think rather ambitiously asked us to write an essay on love and death in Thomas Hardy's poetry. Basic, comprehensive kind of subject. And my recollection is of, first of all, looking at that title and thinking, I've got a clue what this is about. And then reading and rereading and rereading and rereading 4 or 5 of the poems, and a light going on, one of those moments where I thought, yes, I really think I understand what this question's about, and writing a rather impassioned essay on the subject. And I still have the exercise book, actually, with my teacher's comments.
Lovely. And he liked it?
He liked it.
Well, I was brought up in Dorset on the edge of Egdon Heath for 5 or 6 years, and also read a book which is one of my all-time favourites by Llewellyn Powys called Love and Death. Have you ever come across that?
No, I haven't.
Wonderful book about Somerset, actually.
Yeah.
It's very Dorsetish. You were confirmed, obviously.
I was, yes.
And was that an important or turning point in any way? Or?
It was, but I think the more important turning point, in a sense, was a year or two earlier, when, after we'd moved back from Cardiff to Swansea, we stopped going to chapel and started going to church. And that was partly because the local chapel was a bit dull, and the local church was not.
How old were you then?
12, I suppose. And in fact, I suppose I started the ball rolling, really. Makes me shudder a bit to think of it now, but I simply got up very early one Sunday morning and went on my own to the parish church, leaving a note for my parents, and came back and said, that's really nice. And they came with me the following Sunday, and we all agreed, yes, actually, that's much more fun than chapel. And we were fortunate, I think, in having a parish priest who was the most wonderfully creative and supportive person. And it all sounds very positive, but I just feel very fortunate that the teachers and mentors I had in my teens were so encouraging. And this particular parish priest, he spent altogether, I think, about a quarter of a century in the same parish. Never looked for higher office or anything, but he was very well read. He was unexpectedly interested in different bits of the map, literature, politics, and so on. He again gave his time very patiently, very generously to us youngsters. And when at his funeral, many years later, I met somebody who'd been in the choir with me, I remember her saying, "I really hope that our children have somebody who'll be for them what Eddie was for us." An adult who wasn't your mum or dad, who was just a little bit unconventional, not very, just a little bit, pushing the envelope a little, and who never seemed to be impatient or judgmental.
I'm sorry to return to this, but around 17, 18, 19, when I went to university, I particularly became interested in Wordsworth and the idea the rainbow comes and goes and lovely is the rose, but the light has gone off the landscape, and the feelings of something more deeply diffused is beginning to fade, and he tries to recapture it. I was feeling the same thing under the scrutiny of my Oxford dons. This didn't happen to you at that age?
I don't think it did, and I'm wondering a bit why. I think it was partly that A-level English had been for me a very affirming kind of study, and coming up to Cambridge in '68 with what I'd felt of as an immensely nourishing diet. The odd thing is that theology at that time seemed a little bit thin compared with some of what I'd been doing in A-level English and A-level Latin. And some of my first year here, I do remember wondering had I made a mistake in doing theology, because the stimulus and the inspiration had been coming to me from my literary studies. That's where the magic casements seemed to be. And elementary Hebrew somehow didn't quite cut it in the same way. That was in the old days when we had to do Greek and Hebrew in the first year.
Well, I think your explanation can't really be sufficient. It may be necessary, but in my case I was doing all of those. I mean, Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth were my Bibles, and Hopkins at 17, 18, but all the same I began to drift perhaps more at university, or feel that some magic was leaving the landscape. I've rediscovered it in another way in anthropology, but I think it sustained me perhaps for longer. But it didn't act as the bridge into a mature, believing world, but it obviously did with you.
I think it did, yes. So, I don't quite know how it works. But that's how it felt at the time, that I'd been given, especially I suppose in studying people like Hardy, in doing King Lear at A-level, in the first encounters with poets like R.S. Thomas and David Jones in the Welsh world. I'd been given a great deal for the spiritual bank, and the world did feel very crowded and very rich. I read a certain amount of Chesterton when I was in the sixth form, which excited me a lot at the time. It doesn't now, but I think at the time Chesterton's own sense of re-enchanting the environment was a powerful thing for me.
That's interesting. Was it natural? It must have been a bit unusual to go to Oxbridge from that school, or was it not?
A bit unusual. We frequently had one Myrick scholar going to Jesus College, Oxford, per year, but it wasn't an Oxbridge-oriented school.
Why did you come to Cambridge?
We'd had family living in Cambridge for a bit, so quite regularly in my early teens we'd come here on holiday, and I think I'd just developed a fondness for the place on that basis. And I suppose it's that kind of rather random preference that when I was asked in the lower sixth, so what are you thinking of applying? I said, well, I'll have a go at Cambridge. And the other obvious places, London and Durham, were duly listed, but I sat the old scholarship examination for Cambridge. And
did you get one?
I did, yes.
To Clare, was it?
To Christ's.
Christ's, that's right. To read theology.
To read theology. I sat the scholarship in English, but, with the aim of reading theology. But as I say, not without a bit of a divided mind in my first year.
Was Jack Plum the master then?
No, just before that it was Alex Todd.
Right. Do you remember your interview? People sometimes do.
Well, I'd applied originally to St John's and I was interviewed there, and they passed me on to Christ's, so I was only interviewed at St John's. I do remember that. And Andrew McIntosh, then chaplain of St John's and later dean, somebody I still see, and it's ever so slightly surreal when, as recently, I found myself preaching to a congregation with Andrew in it and remembering our first conversation when I was 17. And a conversation which I think was quite important for me because he pressed me a bit, I remember, on what I was interested in within theology. And I think that was when the essay on Love and Death and Thomas Hardy, as it were, came to my aid. I said, well, I'm quite interested in some of these philosophical things. Moved from there.
So let's move to Cambridge. You already knew it, but did it strike you afresh as a student?
It did, because of course it was a completely different Cambridge. My uncle had lived just off Mill Road, and that's not the Cambridge most people see much of. And I also remember on, I think, my second or third night in Cambridge, walking back from something and being stopped by a homeless man on the street and spending the next hour and a half walking the streets with him and just finding out about another kind of Cambridge too. And that never left me, because all through my 3 years I was involved off and on with doing bits and pieces with the homeless in Cambridge. So I think I was aware as an undergraduate of several Cambridges.
Were you involved with any of the other societies strongly? Either secular like the Union or...
Before I came up I thought, yes, I'd love to join the Union. I'd enjoyed debating at school. But realised, I think, when I came up that it was a bit of an all or nothing thing, that if you were going to do the Union you You needed to do very little else. The same with the ADC. So I did a bit of acting, but not systematically. I sang quite a lot. I belonged to a little group of volunteers who went out at weekends to help at the what was then the Spastics Society home at Meldreth. We'd take the bus out on Sunday afternoons and spend a few hours playing with children and helping the staff and all the rest of it. I suppose those are the main non-curricular things.
Otherwise you were studying hard.
I suppose I was really, though I remember talking a lot as well.
That's the most important thing. Do you remember any of your lecturers or teachers who particularly inspired you at that time?
The biggest impact, I think, was from Donald McKinnon. Undoubtedly one of the most unusual characters of Cambridge in my time. Very eccentric, very complex person, very anguished personality. But he was doing a course of lectures in my first year on the problem of evil. And like a lot of people of my generation, I'd read John Hick's book called Evil and the God of Love, which had been published in 66 or 7, and been quite impressed with that. And if you think at all about religious matters, that's the kind of thing you tend to think about. So I thought, although it wasn't on the syllabus, I'd like to go and hear these lectures on the problem of evil. And I was really completely swept away by Donald, who took us into territory that I recognised from my 6th form English. And that was a kind of click moment, feeling actually theology is about these things. He talked about King Lear, he talked about Antigone, he talked about Marx and Hegel, and he talked about the Holocaust, and talked with such intensity and imaginative and moral depth. And it took years before I was able to open John Hick's book again, because he saw this not as a problem to be solved, but as something which, as the French say, donne à penser, it just drives you to think. And when Donald was lecturing, you just knew that you would not get any useful notes to pass exams with. You just had to sit with him and absorb his thought processes, including the long pauses when he'd gaze out of the window or grab the bars of the radiator and shake them. It was, they were never dull, his lectures. And so I went to a lot of his lectures over the 3 years. Later on, of course, became a colleague and a friend. And a lot of us, I think, of that generation, a bit earlier, a bit later, would say that Donald was one of the formative influences. And one of the influences which, how should I put it, allowed things to be difficult. If things were difficult, things were difficult. Don't gloss, don't look for easy formulae, quick solutions. There are times, I think, when that can be almost self-indulgent. I think there were times when Donald was dangerously near that edge, just revelling in the sheer moral awfulness and complexity of it. And yet I wouldn't have had it otherwise. He just made sure we didn't have easy answers. When I read, in those years, or perhaps a little bit later, about Wittgenstein saying to a colleague, "Go the bloody hard way," I thought, yeah, Donald would understand that. And also, he was one of the few, or relatively few, people in Cambridge at the time who was really keeping abreast of continental philosophy, and who, in the 60s and 70s, was telling us that we needed to come to terms with Ricoeur and Gadamer and writers like that. And he would read continental philosophy and theology far more deeply than others, and just pass that on.
I'll probably come back to the problem of evil a bit later, but 68 is the great revolutionary year.
Yes, indeed.
67, 68, and Cambridge was on the edge of it. I was at the LSE at the time. Were you caught up in any of that protest era?
Not very directly. I was aware of it, and I think the last couple of years at school, we were all very conscious of large global questions coming up. In my lower sixth year, I was part of a little group that spent, I think, 2 weeks at Coleg Harlech in North Wales, at a conference which the United Nations Association had organised for school students in Wales. I suppose there must have been 100 or more of us, and we had a fortnight of lectures and seminars on development issues, on global conflicts of various kinds, and it was very intensive. I met my first ever Chinese student on that occasion. I met somebody who'd spent a year doing voluntary work in Bolivia and had sat out a revolution. We had a frank exchange of views with somebody from the South African embassy. And one of the things I remember about that is, of course, the apartheid question is very much in our minds. Someone from the embassy was coming to give the embassy line on South Africa, and rather rashly he distributed the night before a little pamphlet of sort of facts and figures. And I become friendly during this conference with a young man from another school in Carmarthenshire, and we sat up late the previous night. I remember looking through this pamphlet, and I remember him saying, "Look at that statistic," he said, 25% of native African children receive free school education. That means 75% don't. Now, he's now a QC, unsurprisingly, but I can remember the following day after the presentation, John getting up and saying, "According to your own statistics, 75%, 3 out of 4 African school students do not receive free education. What is the possible justification?" And I learned something about politics and rhetoric on that occasion. So yes, these were issues around, but the sort of Paris, événement de mai kind of stuff didn't impact a lot, except that a month or two before I went up to Cambridge, I and a group of friends from Swansea went to Thésée, the religious community in the south of France, for a week. Thésée then, as now, organised large-scale conferences for young people from around Europe. So that was a great experience of meeting students from all around Europe, including some who'd been in Paris in May, and suddenly we were only a handshake away from these events and hearing a bit about what it had been like and what the issues were, and struggling in awful French to discuss these questions in small groups. So I think that was in the background when I started here. But I'd say that probably during my time in Cambridge, my politics were a bit vague. I was a bit more interested in direct social service questions, just because those were the issues that presented themselves. And it took me a while really to formulate where I was politically. And it helped a lot that one of my friends gave me as a 21st birthday present a volume of George Orwell's collected journalism and letters. And when I read that, I thought, yes, I think I know where I belong in this in this map.
You're a fan of George Orwell?
I'm a great fan of Orwell, not an uncritical one. I think he's wrong and silly about a couple of things, but so are most people. What he's right about is immensely impressive.
Were there any your actual face-to-face tutors, supervisors who you remember as being good?
Oh, lots. I was taught by John Riches, who was then chaplain of Sydney Sussex and has been a professor in Glasgow for most of his later career, and again, still a friend. John, I suppose, had just started as a chaplain. I must have been one of his first students. And he'd studied in Germany, and so again, like Donald McKinnon, he had a rather bigger world to draw on. And we spent our first year arguing furiously about the relative merits of Karl Barth and Thomas Aquinas. He'd started reading the work of the Swiss Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar at that point, and he introduced me to Balthasar's work. And 7 or 8 years later, he and I were part of the first translation team putting Balthazar into English. So that was quite important, not least because he was somebody who wanted to argue and argued creatively and expected you to accommodate as he would, so that we both felt we were moving along and sharpening up. So I remember him very, very fondly, gratefully. Stephen Sykes, recently departed, alas, then Dean of St. John's, taught me in my third year, again a very challenging supervisor, but in the best possible way.
I mean, people often allude to the supervision system as one of the main strengths of Oxbridge. Do you think that is the case?
Oh, undoubtedly, yes, undoubtedly. As much as anything, it's the time taken. What you do for the supervision system is not just to write an essay and wait for comments, but ideally, really to argue about what's there, to treat an essay as a discussion opener. And I think with most of my supervisors, I found that was the case.
So let's move on. You come to the end of your 3 years, and then what did you do?
I wanted to do more theology, and I'd become very interested in Eastern Orthodox theology, having had an interest in things Russian for quite a while. And in my third year as an undergraduate, we had a visit from Nicholas Zernov, great Russian émigré figure, who spoke here on the religious renaissance in early 20th century Russian literature and philosophy. And I was completely fascinated by that, and read Nicholas's book on the subject, and decided I'd like to explore that a bit further. Nobody much here seemed to know much about it. Indeed, nobody much anywhere seemed to know much about it, but I applied to Oxford eventually. And spent eventually 4 years there, completing a doctorate on the work of Vladimir Lossky, one of the Russian émigré thinkers of the 20th century, putting him against the background of 19th century Russian thought and also early Greek Christian thought, with the streams that fertilized his own thinking.
What languages did you need for that?
Well, I knew I'd have to get on top of Russian as best I could. But fortunately, Lossky spent most of his adult life in France and published a lot in French. So I learned enough Russian to read the basic texts that he was using, and to read a fair bit of some of the theologians of the generation before him. And happily discovered a real treasure trove in the form of a whole bundle of unpublished lectures by Lossky, which had been transcribed from tape recordings, and spent a good deal of my second year just working through this mound of raw material. He died quite young, in his 50s. These were the last lectures he gave, so you could see how his thought was maturing at the very point when he died.
Later, when you wrote your study of Dostoevsky, did you refresh your Russian or make it?
I did, yes, I had to. Because I never learned it as systematically as I'd have liked, and never been able to speak it with any ease or confidence, I have had to dust it off from time to time. You know what they say about languages you learn after you're 21 or 22, they don't tend to go in quite as deeply, unless you're using them all the time. And I learned German when I was 20, and Russian when I was 21, 22, and I know that my German is, passable, but not wonderful. My Russian.
You translated from Rilke, presumably from the German, so it's good enough to do.
Good enough for that, and good enough for basic conversational purposes. And there was a point in my 20s when I had a German girlfriend for a while, which helped no end.
That helps. Who was your supervisor in Oxford?
A man called Donald Orchin. He wasn't really a specialist in things Russian, but he knew a great deal about the Orthodox Church. And I think what he did for me as a supervisor was not so much academic direction as just networking, introducing me to people. He was another of those people who said, "Oh, you must read so-and-so, and you must meet so-and-so," and would come into your room with a new pile of stuff and say, lots of interesting things there. Terribly unsystematic. And by today's standards, you'd say a perfectly terrible supervisor, but in fact he did what I needed in that respect.
Were you doing anything else particularly during those 4 years?
In Oxford, quite a lot, I suppose. Again, I was singing quite a bit.
Choirs.
And we had a little sort of chamber group in Wadham. Again, some involvement in working with the homeless and other groups like that. A little bit of drama. I played Thomas More in Men for All Seasons.
Yeah, it seems appropriate.
And also, I suppose, trying to keep up my interest in some other areas. I think it must have been my second or third year as a research student. My supervisor suggested I might go to the States for a visit to meet some of the Russian émigré scholars in the States, which was actually a very good idea indeed. But in order to pay my way, he arranged that I should do some lectures at a seminary in New York on T.S. Eliot. And because that was a huge and long-standing interest, I was able to write up some stuff for that, deliver those lectures. That subsidised my trip, and it all worked out rather well.
You mentioned the singing a number of times. You didn't play an instrument as well?
No, I'm a genuinely very bad pianist. That is not modesty. I'm a very bad pianist. I'd learned a bit when I was a child, but never really got it up to a serious level. No, singing was always the big musical thing, and for me, one of the greatest joys.
Well, I was going to ask just one bit further on music. I mean, is it still very important in your life? And
very, yes.
And what music? I mean, in particular.
Well, where to start? I suppose in my teens I got very interested in early music. Tudor music, certainly. What little there was available then of medieval music. And I can also remember in 66 or 7, sitting in my bedroom trying to adjust a very cheap transistor radio to get the Aldborough Festival for the first performance of Britain's Burning Fiery Furnace, because Britain was a great inspiration. And Vaughan Williams. I think in my teens I was really very much in love with that late romantic, early modern English school. And I hadn't at that point quite cracked the great central body, if you like, in Bach and Mozart and so on. But that came very quickly at Cambridge. So from Monteverdi to Mozart would be my enthusiasm in those days, and probably still is, to be honest.
Is it? And out of all those?
Bach, without a doubt. And I deeply love Mozart, and I think know most of the Magic Flute by heart. But I also liked the Tudor songwriters, Dowland, Morley, people like that, and Purcell. And as a singer, you develop a particular attitude to composers. So Mozart is wonderful for singers, Purcell's wonderful for singers, Bach is purgatory.
When you were here, did you come to the chapel at all and hear services and the carols? And
not very often. I did occasionally. But I was singing in the choir at Christ's, so that took up quite a bit of time, and there were all these other little groups that came and went in college and out of college, the little madrigal groups and chamber groups that I enjoyed.
Some people, I think possibly in your poetry, I'm not sure, but some people certainly allude to the fact that poetry seems to be one of the gateways to the numinous, to God. Do you find that?
Oh, definitely, yes. Yes. I think with both poetry and music, you're dealing quintessentially with those bits of human operation that don't fit neatly within the prepaid seats and the preordained categories, where you're not quite sure what's going on, and you never will be, because every time you turn round it's moved. People ask sometimes about where poetry comes from, and of course the answer is you really cannot get at it. If you say, I'm now going to sit down and write a poem, you can't do it. But there are moments when you suddenly realise that your subconscious or whatever has been working on a picture or a word or a phrase or a sensation, and is beginning to nudge you, get this down, as if someone's opened a door and shouted, come, take dictation, and you get it down.
I don't know, I'm sure you remember W.B. Yeats's answer to the question of where his poetry was: in the nib of his pen, as the pen strikes the paper.
Yes, very much so. I certainly find that the act of writing takes you forward. I'm not one of those who can compose in my head. I do need a page in front of me. And what I need, I suppose, is that sense that there's a phrase or a picture somewhere that's, as I say, nudging, and get that down, and then think, now, what comes before and after? Where does that belong? And you gradually move out. There's a phrase in, I think it's a lecture by Charles Williams, C.S. Lewis's friend Charles Williams, where he imagines Shakespeare. It's a poem of his, that's right. He imagines Shakespeare on the Underground in London. So imagine sitting on the tube with a newspaper, his hat pulled down, and a pencil in his hand, scribbling. And he's just thought of the first line of The Merchant of Venice, which is, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubim. Now, how on earth you derive the rest of the play from that line, you don't know, but I thought that was a really interesting way in. There's a word, there's a phrase, and you think, where does it belong? And you move outward and outward from that.
And how do you like to write? I mean, some people, Houseman used to have a large lunch and a certain amount of beer, and then he would go for a walk, and when he came back he had all the stanzas in his mind, apparently. Other people like silence, other people like blaring music around them, or is there any particular pattern to your writing?
I write quite a lot when I'm travelling. Long train journeys have a lot to answer for, I think, in stuff that I've written.
Airport lounges.
Airport lounges. Places that are nowhere in particular. I think that helps me. And it does help for it to be quiet, because I want to listen. I do think poetry has to sound like something. And I think it is written to be read aloud, ultimately.
You don't, like Maitland, speak it aloud as you write?
Sometimes. If I need to know where the balance lies in a line, it's like sort of testing it and testing a balance in your hand. And you think, yes, actually that syllable's not quite doing it, or that's the wrong word. It's just slightly out of kilter. And when you say it, you sometimes discover that. And sometimes, of course, you don't discover it, and sometimes you just, as Auden said, don't complete it, you abandon it. Put down the best you can, and hope not too many people notice.
And then, like Kipling in his autobiography says, when you've finished writing, suddenly your daimon disappears. It's like a light switch going, and you stop.
You stop. Yes, that's right. And that's why I find it quite difficult to edit poetry. There's a lot of correction and scribbling and redoing that happens when you're still in the process. But I find, on the whole, when I look at something I've done, I may think, oh, that's awful, but not necessarily, and I could do this and this to it. The moment's gone.
Had finished your DPhil, and what did you do next?
I went to Yorkshire, to the College of the Resurrection, the theological college. Murfield. Yes. Run by the Community of the Resurrection, the monastic community there. I was still very much in two minds about, well, more than two minds, about my future. I'd enjoyed the research, I wanted to do more, and wanted to teach, I had the nagging question about what I should be doing as far as priesthood was concerned. I was also wrestling with whether I ought to be a monk. So going to Mirfield, where I was living with a monastic community, living alongside people preparing for the priesthood and doing more academic teaching and writing, was quite a good holding operation for a couple of years, and a very precious couple of years, where the rootedness in the community's life, I think, did a great deal to stabilise my thinking, left me reasonably persuaded that it was time I offered myself for ordination in the Church of England, reasonably persuaded that it probably wasn't right at that juncture to try my vocation in the monastery. And so when the offer came of coming back to Cambridge to be ordained as chaplain of Westcott House, I said yes. But a very important period. And because I was doing quite a lot of lecturing in those 2 years, and not a huge amount of Cambridge-style supervising, I had quite a lot of time to read and digest stuff, and a lot of the material for my first book came from what I was working on at that time, on the history of Christian spirituality.
Tell me about the first book.
It was published in 1979, I think. It's called The Wound of Knowledge, which is a phrase from R.S. Thomas, Pope R.S. Thomas, subtitled Christian Spirituality from the New Testament to St. John of the Cross. And essentially, I boiled down a long course of lectures from Mirfield into a shorter course for Cambridge, looking at the major figures in Christian thinking about prayer and contemplation from the 1st to the 16th century.
Pain and... You were looking at being deaf, I missed this.
Sorry, looking at people who are writing about Christian prayer and spirituality, the contemplative life from the 1st to the 16th century. It's a book, some pages of which now make me blush, because when you're in your 20s you know so much more than you do later on. Some of the judgments there I wouldn't endorse now, and I think I read a lot, but digested it very imperfectly, of course. But it's still in print, and seems to ring a bell with some people.
You then, you were at the chaplain, for how long?
I was 3 years at Westcott, and then there was a lectureship in the university that became vacant, and I was encouraged to apply for that. But I also at that time wanted to make sure that I had some pastoral parochial experience, so offered my services at St George's, Chesterton, Cambridge, as an unpaid curate, and they happened to have a curate's house that was free. So the next 3 years I spent living on the Arbury estate and dividing my time really between doing Sunday schools and pastoral visiting up there and teaching patristics and so forth here at the university.
As in your earlier experience, you discovered there are several Cambridges in Arbury.
Yes.
You enjoy teaching? You did?
Oh, enormously, yes. Yes.
All kinds, or?
All kinds, I suppose. Supervising, the one-to-one is very special. And I think I'm a reasonably good lecturer, but looking back, I think I probably overstuffed my lectures in those days very considerably.
Too many facts.
Too many facts, yes. I do remember a colleague tactfully saying to me once when I was teaching here in the late 70s or early 80s that some of his students were finding my stuff a bit hard going. I remember bridling very indignantly. Who could possibly find this stuff difficult? And I realised in retrospect exactly what I was doing. I look at my notes from those days and think, oh my goodness, how did they sit it out?
Yeah, we all do it at the beginning. You then, I'm skipping through your life very quickly now because I want to get to one or two general things. So there was a certain amount of time, and then you went to Oxford as professor.
Yes, I was for a couple of years Dean of Clare, which I would very happily have stayed in for a long time, but was rather taken aback when I simply had a postcard one day announcing that I had been elected to the Lady Margaret Chair of Divinity in Oxford, for which I hadn't applied.
Those were the days.
Those were the days. And after the some mistake surely moment, I consulted one or two people around who said, well, it's not every day you get elected to a chair in Oxford, perhaps you better go.
Famous chair.
So off I went to Oxford.
You've been back and forth twice between these universities and come back here. People often ask what is very simply the difference between them. I've been back and forth too, but how would you characterise from your experience?
Apart from the obvious things in their history and ethos, Cambridge has that much more mathematical and scientific flavour, etc. I've always found that Cambridge takes itself a little less seriously than Oxford.
Less or more?
Less.
Less.
But there's an element of saving irony in Cambridge. That's partly because when I first went to Oxford, to Christ Church in 1971, I came to an institution which at that time seemed to take itself very seriously indeed.
Was Hugh Trevor Roper still there?
No, I don't think he was.
Actually, he lived in
He lived in Christ Church.
He was at Oriel.
Yes. I developed great affection for Christ Church later when I was there as a professor, and great affection for successive deans, for Henry Chadwick and Eric Eaton. But going there from Christ's was quite a culture shock, because I did feel Christ's had a slightly more bracing, no-nonsense feel to it.
It's the wind.
It's the wind, exactly, yes.
And then, again, skipping forward to your, presumably your last major appointment as Archbishop, was that on a postcard as well? Or?
No. When I first moved from Oxford, it wasn't quite like that, but it was again a lot more informal. It was a letter saying, your name is being considered as a Bishop of Monmouth. And I felt if I were invited to go back to Wales, I'd like to. And so when I was elected, I said yes to that, and was hugely happy in Monmouth for just over 10 years. 3 of those as Archbishop of Wales as well. And then that bizarre period when everybody was gossiping about who was going to be Archbishop of Canterbury, and I knew my name was being gossiped about and couldn't quite believe that it was going to happen. And not a postcard, but in this case, a leak in the Times.
Really?
My chaplain rang me up at about 6 one morning and said, have you seen the Times? And I said, no. And he said, I think you ought to.
You'd been elected?
Apparently I'd been nominated, and somebody on the Crown Nominations Commission had leaked the news, and it was all very embarrassing because I had no notion if this was true or not. Because in those days the last thing anybody did was consult you about that sort of thing.
So they hadn't asked you whether you'd like to do it?
No. Well, that's not quite true. The then Archbishop of York, whom I knew quite well, had at one point at a meeting taken me aside and said, we're doing the Canterbury appointment, and if you were asked, would you turn it down out of hand? I said, well, I probably wouldn't turn it down out of hand. But that was the nearest I got to consultation.
He'd been asked to find out if there was...
I suppose, yes. But it was very strange, both that period of several months when the appointment was being discussed, and then a strange period of a few days when nobody could confirm or deny this story in the Times. And then the period that followed when a number of people actively tried to derail the appointment. So,
on what grounds? You're Welsh?
No, that I was too liberal. And thinking in Oxford had the reputation of being really theologically rather conservative.
Mm.
I found this quite odd, but it was, to be honest, it was a really disagreeable and unpleasant time.
Mm. It is.
The whole process, the whole year, the whole of
You often
2000.
find people you thought were friends suddenly come out with this.
Not so much that, but I hadn't, I think, quite registered how much venom there could be around these matters. And because I'd been, well, I was known as somebody who had a more liberal approach to homosexuality than some. That was, that was the great unacceptable
What else were
thing.
you too liberal about?
Well, I don't know.
Colour,
I
or
think it was only that, actually.
the poor, or
Just that. And it had never been an issue in Wales. I think people knew my views. I didn't push them. I don't think it's a bishop's place to be a campaigner. So if I were asked, I'd say, well, yes, I would quite welcome a change on this, but we're not there yet, and it takes the time it takes. But suddenly that became an absolutely focal issue.
Yes, I remember that vaguely. I mean, if I may say so, you were a very good archbishop, and as archbishops go, you were very good. But I don't often have a chance to interview such people, so I'd like to know what to beware of if you're asked to be Archbishop of Canterbury.
I think you do have to register early on the fact that you are going to be unpopular with quite a lot of people quite a lot of the time, by which I don't mean
Spitting image.
and I don't either mean that you'll have lots of people just being consistently unpleasant, but that you become a focus for a lot of negative feeling, which isn't necessarily personal, but you're there to throw things at. And especially in the internet age, which really got into its stride in my years as Archbishop, people don't think that there's a person at the other end, and they will very willingly fling a lot of mud. So be prepared for that. I used to say, I still do sometimes say to young clergy, when you're first ordained, bear in mind that you will feature in other people's dreams and fantasies in a new way. And I think that's true with knobs on if you're a bishop or archbishop. It's one thing to beware of. And then I think there's the fickleness of the media. You may think you have a friend, or you may think you can use the media positively. It's very difficult, because it's a bit like the Indian fable of, what is it? Is it a fox or someone carrying a scorpion across the river on its back? And the scorpion, as it stings the fox in mid-river, says, "Sorry, can't help myself. That's what I do." That's what the press does. I think they sting. You're never going to be in credit. Stories will establish themselves quite irrespective of fact, sense, or anything else.
What about just the practical pressures of combining thought and prayer and meditation with a huge amount of administration and personnel work?
Well, the only thing to do is, I think, have a very rigorous timetable. And, at Lambeth Palace we had 2 nuns who lived on the premises and would look after the chapel and be there first thing every morning. And it helped to know that every morning the sisters would have been there from 6:30, and when I went down to say my prayers, they'd always be there, and the day always started with that, and that was just the anchor point. But balancing it all out, yes, it's arguably several different jobs all at once, and you end up feeling you're doing none of them very well. I used to get asked quite a lot to do lectures and things, and I wrote all my own material, so that was quite time consuming in itself. I tried to deal with as much of my correspondence personally as I could, especially from children or young people. That took up a bit of time as well. And then there were the committees to chair, the debates in the Lords to attend, and the rest. And the international travel.
Yeah, it's the most quiet time in Cambridge now.
It's the theory.
These are very sort of, I'm speaking on behalf of your audience in the world, so they might ask you just to name your high point. What was your most wonderful moment, and your low point? What was your worst moment? They can be singled out.
Yes. High points, I'm not sure. There were several. And I don't think any one stands out. There were one or two international visits that I remember particularly vividly. A deeply moving visit to the Solomon Islands and dedicating a memorial there to the Melanesian brothers who'd been killed in the Civil War a year earlier. And that sense that I sometimes had in these foreign visits, this is the front line, this is where it actually matters. And late in my time, I guess, the visit to Zimbabwe and the difficult confrontation with Robert Mugabe there, which was a demanding moment, but quite an important one, and helped just a little bit to shift some of the pressure from the church in Zimbabwe at the time. And in the last couple of years, not a moment, but a process of putting together an international umbrella organisation for Anglican-based relief and development agencies, and having the most wonderful colleagues to do that with, a sense of pure joy in seeing that taking shape and being in the right hands, that I just can't describe enthusiastically enough. That was a wonderful sensation. The bad moments, well, I suppose people might expect me to say the controversy over Sharia in 2008. But actually, although that was maddening, strangely I didn't feel it as personally difficult as some other moments. I'd said what I said, what I meant to say. I don't think I said it as well as I could have. And there were a few days of hysteria, and then it rather blew over. And I didn't actually lose a great deal of sleep over it. Much worse, I think, was the period right at the beginning, when there was the controversy over the nomination to the Bishopric of Reading, and my friend Geoffrey John had been nominated, and there was an outcry of protest right across the world because he'd been in a same-sex relationship. And coming to the point where I thought I'd have to ask him to step down, that was terrible. There were moments then where I thought, if it's going to be like this, I can't do it.
I'm glad you went on.
But the decisions you take that you know are damaging, that you know are imperfect, and doesn't seem any other place to go.
Perhaps coming back to one or two of the earlier threads, particularly the lectures by McKinnon, I think it was, on the problem of evil. The logical problem I had, I think, from about the age of 18 or 19, I had two. One was, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, and therefore could do anything he wanted, how is it that he's created a world which you and I know is filled with pain and suffering? Either he isn't all-loving, or he isn't all-powerful, or it's an illusion of what we're seeing. And I've never been able to square that.
Yes, I don't think there is or will be any neat answer to that. Someone had solved it. They tell us. Nobody has.
They would have told us by now.
They would have told us by now. I sort of feel my way around the edge of the problem, I think, by saying, first of all, there's a question as to whether a cost-free or risk-free universe could really exist. In other words, God's freedom, God's power, may in some sense be constrained by what, logically, a world of finite events and temporal evolution might mean. God can't do logical impossibilities. Maybe if there's to be a world at all, it has to be a world in which there's risk or chance or whatever. Now that doesn't get you very far, but it's just one small question to put in the balance. The other thing, I suppose, is, as somebody put it, we not only have a problem of evil, we have a problem of good. It's a universe in which appalling things happen. Also a universe in which people are surprisingly convinced about the power and resource of grace or love or whatever, and keep going through it. If some people in the very heart of the most agonizing pain and loss can sustain faith, that sort of says to me, well, maybe I can too, without having to get all the answers tied up at this stage. And I've met so many people in that sort of position, not just as Archbishop, but even before then. And one of my memories from my student days is one summer, doing some volunteer children's work in Bedford. I got talking with the caretaker of the school that we were spreading our sleeping bags in. And he'd lost a 5-year-old child. And I'll never forget listening to him talking about that. And talking about it with a complete lack of consolation or ease, but with a kind of acceptance. And here was a man without any education or sophistication particularly, talking very bluntly, in terms rather like Job saying the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. And I was rather in awe of that. And it's people like that. Harry, I remember Harry Blizzard. People like that I think of this problem, that any account of the universe has to weigh the fact that people like that are not being trivial or silly. So I think there's a kind of very incipient, very inchoate logical response about, is there something in the very nature of finite reality? And then there's the human and emotional response. And that's about as far as it gets, I think.
I remember it was the wreck of the Deutschland, Hopkins, that sort of quintessentially, when I was studying Hopkins about 1718, put the problem very well, which I've never resolved. The other problem I had was that being brought up in India and travelling back to India a couple of times, my mother became a Buddhist, and when I asked some of my Anglican friends about the position and condition and hopes for non-Christians, at that time they were fairly sure that these people would not find salvation. And I felt that for 2/3 of the human race not to be within the fold seemed a bit unfair.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess the overwhelming majority of Anglicans, and probably of Roman Catholics, I would say, that misconceives the problem. It's not as if God on Judgment Day looks at your form and says, Buddhist, sorry, not taking any of those. My question is, how does the grace of God actually work in the lives of people outside the Christian family to produce strengths, virtues and depths that are sufficiently like what I recognise as the marks of holiness for me to say, well, there's something there we have in common. For me, that's to be thought through and understood in terms of the presence of Christ. That's why I'm a Christian. But that doesn't mean I will immediately go to the Buddhist or the Hindu and say, you're a Christian, really. Because they're not.
Yes.
But whatever is working in them is something I can say has enough family resemblance for me to relate to, learn from, engage with in some way.
Just last couple of questions. If you had to choose one of your books or writings which you would like to be remembered for most, which would it be and why?
Actually, I think the book of mine that I'm most simply satisfied with is the little study of St. Teresa of Avila. I found it a very helpful discipline to sit and untangle and set out what I thought she was saying, with a minimum of commentary, and hope that it made sense, and hope that it opened the door for somebody into one of the great minds of the Christian centuries. And I think of all my books, that's the one I felt actually I did what I set out to do. And it's not a great book, but it's one I'm pleased with.
Lovely. And in terms of poetry, is there any poem of yours or set of poems which you are most satisfied with or happiest about?
I suppose there's a little group of poems I wrote which were all rather stirred by the deaths of my parents and one or two friends. It's a sequence called Graves and Gates, and it's got a poem about Rilke, a poem about Nietzsche, a poem about Simone Weil, and one about Tolstoy, and then one for my mother, one for my father, and one for my dear friend Gillian Rose, the philosopher. And I remember starting writing that poem on the train on the way back from her deathbed. Those poems came from somewhere quite urgent. And then there's a sequence in the last collection I published, which is a set of 21 haiku, one for each chapter of St. John's Gospel.
They're in the haiku form?
Yes.
5 line, 4 lines, yes.
I don't know quite why that suggested itself, except that I find myself writing a haiku about one particular verse or incident in St. John's Gospel, and looking at it and thinking, I wonder if you could do this for every chapter. And so doing the sequence of 21.
I should have found out, are you married? Or?
Yes, I am. My wife is also a theologian. We met here in Cambridge in the late 70s, and she's from a clergy family as well.
And you have children?
We have a daughter of 27 who's a school teacher in South London, and a son of 19 who is a student of English and drama in Norwich.
Norwich? That's where my granddaughter's going. So,
much to be recommended, I think.
Now, I've missed huge chunks of your life, but is there anything I should have asked you about you would have liked to have talked about?
I don't think so. If you're content, I am.
The only other question I often ask people, scientists, to say advice for a young scientist going into science, that kind of thing. Is there any advice you give to someone contemplating the ministry? Quite a lot, really, I suppose, and it's the kind of advice I'd give every year when I was ordaining people. As I said earlier, be prepared for what it feels like to be in other people's minds and other people's fantasies. Just remember that, and then remember that ultimately you're not answerable to other people's expectations. Don't ignore them, but don't be a slave to them. And try to live in such a way that you prompt people to feel grateful, not necessarily for you, but for what you represent. And when you preach, aim at producing gratitude. Well, it's too late for me now, I think, but if I'd had that advice earlier, maybe I would have, for one moment I did think of going into the ministry, but I became an anthropologist, which is my religion. So,
which is a vocation, as you were saying earlier.
Indeed. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome.